Welcome to another journey through history's quieter moments. Tonight, we explore the challenging world of medieval merchant women, where commerce and survival intertwined in ways that might surprise you. From dawn markets to dangerous trade routes, these women navigated a world that offered both opportunity and peril at every turn.
Picture yourself in a bustling medieval marketplace around the year 1300. The air fills with the scent of fresh bread, leather goods, and exotic spices from distant lands. Among the crowd of merchants calling out their wares, you notice something remarkable. Women dressed in practical wool gowns with leather aprons stand behind wooden stalls, haggling with customers, counting coins, and managing their businesses with practiced efficiency. These merchant women were not merely helping their husbands or fathers. Many operated as independent traders, guild members, and business owners in their own right. Yet their stories remain largely untold, overshadowed by the more dramatic tales of knights and nobles that dominate our understanding of medieval life. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, witnessed the gradual rise of a merchant class that would eventually reshape European society. Within this emerging commercial world, women carved out significant roles, though their participation came with unique challenges that their male counterparts rarely faced. To understand the complexity of their lives, we must first consider the legal framework that governed medieval women's existence. Under the system known as coverture, married women had no independent legal identity. They could not own property, sign contracts, or conduct business without their husband's explicit permission. This legal doctrine, derived from both Roman law and Germanic traditions, created the first major obstacle for women seeking to engage in commerce. However, medieval society was far more pragmatic than these legal restrictions might suggest. Economic necessity often trumped legal theory, particularly in the growing towns and cities where commerce thrived. When husbands died, traveled for extended periods, or simply needed additional income, women stepped into commercial roles by necessity rather than choice. The concept of the femme sole, or single woman, provided one pathway to commercial independence. Unmarried women, widows, and in some cases, married women whose husbands were absent, could gain legal recognition as independent traders. This status allowed them to own property, enter contracts, and be held legally responsible for their business dealings. Consider the case of Alice de Bruyne, a widow who managed extensive estates and commercial enterprises in 14th century England. Her household accounts, which survive to this day, reveal a woman who oversaw grain production, livestock management, and trade relationships that extended across multiple counties. She negotiated directly with merchants, managed seasonal workers, and maintained detailed financial records that would impress modern accountants. The guild system, which dominated medieval urban commerce, presented both opportunities and barriers for women merchants. Guilds were associations of craftsmen and traders who controlled specific industries within a town or city. They set prices, maintained quality standards, and provided mutual support for their members. Some guilds welcomed women as full members, particularly in industries traditionally associated with female work such as textile production, brewing, and food preparation. The Silk Weavers Guild in Paris, for example, was predominantly female. Women controlled every aspect of silk production, from importing raw materials to selling finished luxury fabrics to wealthy clients. These silk merchants often accumulated considerable wealth and social status, owning multiple properties and employing dozens of workers. Similarly, in the brewing industry, women dominated production and sales throughout much of the medieval period. Known as brewsters or alewives, these women operated taverns, produced beer for local consumption, and even exported their products to neighboring towns. The brewing process required significant knowledge of fermentation, ingredient sourcing, and quality control, skills that were passed down through generations of women. However, even in female-dominated industries, women faced restrictions that limited their full participation. Many guilds prohibited women from taking on apprentices, restricting their ability to pass on skills and expand their businesses. Others limited the hours during which women could operate their shops or the types of customers they could serve. The daily routine of a medieval merchant woman began before dawn. In the textile trades, women would rise early to check on overnight dyeing processes or to begin the labor-intensive work of spinning, weaving, or embroidering. Those involved in food production faced the challenge of creating fresh products daily, as preservation methods were limited and customers expected quality goods. Market days brought particular intensity to their work. Women would load their goods onto carts, travel to designated market squares, and spend long hours standing behind their stalls. They needed to be skilled negotiators, capable of assessing the quality of goods offered in trade, calculating complex exchange rates when dealing with foreign merchants, and managing inventory to minimize losses from spoilage or theft. The physical demands of merchant life were considerable. Women regularly lifted heavy bolts of cloth, sacks of grain, or casks of ale. They walked long distances between suppliers and customers, often carrying substantial loads. During winter months, they worked in unheated shops and market stalls, their hands becoming cracked and sore from handling rough materials in cold conditions. Financial management required sophisticated skills that many women developed through practical experience rather than formal education. They needed to understand credit systems, seasonal price fluctuations, and the complex web of debts and obligations that characterized medieval commerce. Many kept detailed accounts, tracking not only their own transactions, but also the credit histories of regular customers. The social position of merchant women varied significantly based on their wealth, location, and the specific nature of their trade. Successful merchants could achieve considerable social mobility, moving from humble origins to positions of respect within their communities. They might own multiple properties, employ servants, and marry their children into higher social classes. Yet even wealthy merchant women faced social scrutiny that their male counterparts avoided. Society viewed women's commercial activities with suspicion, particularly when they achieved significant success. Religious authorities often preached against women who prioritized business over domestic duties, while secular authorities sometimes viewed successful businesswomen as threats to traditional social hierarchies. The clothing and appearance of merchant women reflected their complex social position. They needed to dress well enough to inspire confidence in potential customers and business partners, but not so extravagantly as to attract criticism for exceeding their proper station. Sumptuary laws, which regulated who could wear certain fabrics or colors, often specifically targeted merchant families who had acquired wealth but lacked noble birth. Regional variations in laws and customs created different opportunities and challenges for merchant women across medieval Europe. In some Italian city-states, women enjoyed relatively broad commercial rights and could inherit and manage businesses with fewer restrictions. German towns often granted women significant trading privileges, particularly in the lucrative textile and metalworking industries. English merchant women operated under different constraints, with common law traditions that were generally more restrictive than continental European practices. However, the growth of London as a major commercial center created opportunities for women willing to navigate complex legal and social obstacles. The intersection of commerce and family life created unique pressures for medieval merchant women. Unlike their male counterparts who could focus primarily on business concerns, women were expected to maintain households, raise children, and fulfill social obligations while managing their commercial enterprises. This dual responsibility required exceptional organizational skills and physical stamina. As we delve deeper into their world, we'll discover how these remarkable women balanced competing demands, overcame legal obstacles, and built businesses that supported their families and communities. Their stories reveal not only the challenges they faced, but also the ingenuity, determination, and resilience that enabled them to thrive in a world that offered them few guarantees and many obstacles.
The legal landscape of medieval Europe created a complex web of restrictions that fundamentally shaped how merchant women could operate in commerce. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed into that of her husband. She could not own property in her own name, could not enter into contracts without his consent, and had no legal standing to sue or be sued in court. This meant that even the most successful female merchants found themselves operating within severe legal constraints that their male counterparts simply did not face.
However, the reality of medieval commerce often demanded practical solutions that bent these rigid legal frameworks. In many trading cities, the concept of the femme sole emerged as a legal workaround. This status allowed married women to trade independently of their husbands, essentially granting them the legal rights of unmarried women for commercial purposes. To achieve this status, a woman typically needed her husband's formal consent, often documented in writing and witnessed by local authorities. The process itself was telling of the restrictions women faced, requiring male permission to engage in activities that men could pursue freely. The femme sole status was not uniformly available across medieval Europe. In England, it became relatively common in major trading centers like London, York, and Norwich. The City of London's customs explicitly recognized the rights of femmes sole to trade independently, allowing them to be held liable for their own debts and to sue in their own name. This legal recognition was crucial for women who needed to establish credit relationships with suppliers, negotiate contracts with customers, and resolve disputes that inevitably arose in commercial dealings. Yet even with femme sole status, women faced ongoing legal vulnerabilities. If a woman's business failed and she accumulated debts, her husband could potentially revoke his consent to her trading, leaving creditors with limited recourse. This uncertainty made some merchants hesitant to extend credit to women, even those with established businesses. The legal system's fundamental assumption that women were dependents, rather than independent economic actors, created persistent challenges that required constant navigation. Property ownership presented another layer of legal complexity for merchant women. While unmarried women and widows could generally own property outright, married women's property rights were severely limited. A successful female merchant might accumulate substantial assets through her trading activities, but legally, these assets often belonged to her husband. This created practical problems when women needed to use their property as collateral for loans, or when they wanted to pass their businesses on to their children. The guild system, which dominated urban commerce throughout medieval Europe, presented its own set of legal restrictions for women. Most guilds were male-dominated institutions that controlled access to particular trades and crafts. Guild membership was typically restricted to men who had completed formal apprenticeships, a process that was rarely available to women. Without guild membership, women were often prohibited from practicing certain trades or selling particular goods within city limits. Some guilds did allow female membership, but usually under specific circumstances. Widows of guild members might be allowed to continue their deceased husband's businesses, but often with restrictions on hiring apprentices or expanding operations. Daughters of guild members sometimes inherited limited trading rights, but these were frequently conditional and could be revoked if they married outside the guild or failed to maintain certain standards. The legal system's treatment of commercial disputes involving women revealed deep-seated biases about female competence in business matters. When women brought cases to commercial courts, they often faced skepticism about their understanding of trade practices and their ability to manage complex business relationships. Court records from medieval London show that women plaintiffs were sometimes required to provide additional documentation or witnesses to support claims that would have been accepted more readily from male merchants. Inheritance laws created both opportunities and restrictions for merchant women. While women could inherit property and businesses, the rules governing these inheritances were complex and varied significantly by region. In some areas, women inherited equally with their brothers, while in others, male heirs received preferential treatment. The concept of dower rights meant that widows were entitled to a portion of their deceased husband's estates, but this was typically limited to 1/3 of the total assets and was intended for their maintenance rather than for business expansion. The legal restrictions on women's commercial activities were often justified by contemporary beliefs about female nature and capabilities. Legal treatises of the period frequently argued that women were naturally suited to domestic roles and lacked the rational capacity needed for complex business dealings. These beliefs were codified into law through various statutes and municipal regulations that explicitly limited women's commercial rights. Despite these restrictions, many merchant women found creative ways to work within the legal system. They formed partnerships with male relatives who could provide the necessary legal standing for certain transactions. They used informal networks of female merchants to share information about legal strategies and to provide mutual support in navigating complex regulations. Some women even used their restricted legal status to their advantage, arguing in court that they should not be held fully responsible for business decisions made under their husband's authority. The enforcement of legal restrictions on women's commercial activities varied considerably depending on local circumstances and economic needs. In times of economic prosperity, authorities might be more willing to overlook technical violations of trading regulations by women. During periods of economic hardship, however, these same regulations might be strictly enforced as a way to limit competition for scarce commercial opportunities. Regional variations in legal systems created different opportunities and challenges for merchant women across medieval Europe. The legal traditions of Roman law, Germanic law, and canon law all influenced how women's commercial rights were defined and protected. In some Italian city-states, for example, women enjoyed relatively broad commercial freedoms, while in other regions, restrictions were more severe and consistently enforced. The documentation of women's legal status in commercial matters provides insight into the daily realities of female merchants. Court records, guild registers, and municipal ordinances reveal the constant negotiation between formal legal restrictions and practical commercial needs. These sources show that while the legal system created significant obstacles for merchant women, it did not completely prevent their participation in medieval commerce. As we examine these legal frameworks, we see how they created a foundation of uncertainty and restriction that merchant women had to navigate throughout their careers. The need for male consent, the limitations on property ownership, and the barriers to guild membership all combined to create a challenging environment that required exceptional skill, determination, and creativity to overcome successfully. The guild system of medieval Europe presented merchant women with their most formidable institutional barriers. These powerful organizations controlled virtually every aspect of commercial life, from who could sell what goods to where they could establish their shops. For women, gaining entry into these exclusive brotherhoods required navigating a labyrinth of legal restrictions, social prejudices, and economic obstacles that would challenge even the most determined entrepreneurs. Guilds operated as closed societies, jealously guarding their privileges and maintaining strict hierarchy. The typical path to membership began with a lengthy apprenticeship, usually starting in childhood. Young boys would be bound to master craftsmen for 7 to 10 years, learning not only the technical skills of their trade, but also the social connections that would sustain their careers. Women faced immediate exclusion from this foundational system, as most guilds explicitly prohibited female apprentices. The few exceptions to this rule came with significant caveats. In some textile guilds, particularly those dealing with silk production or fine embroidery, women could serve as apprentices, but only under the supervision of female masters who had inherited their positions through marriage or widowhood. These opportunities remained scarce and highly competitive, with preference given to daughters of existing guild members. Marriage represented the most common pathway for women to access guild privileges, but even this route came with restrictions. When a woman married a guild member, she typically gained the right to assist in his business, but her role remained subordinate and her activities closely monitored. Guild regulations often specified exactly what tasks she could perform, which customers she could serve, and what hours she could work. The widow's privilege offered perhaps the most significant opportunity for women to achieve something approaching full guild membership. When a guild member died, his widow might inherit the right to continue operating his business, provided she met certain conditions. She usually had to demonstrate her competence in the trade, maintain the quality standards expected of guild members, and often pay substantial fees to retain her privileges. However, these inheritance rights came with time limits and restrictions that made long-term success difficult. Many guilds required widows to remarry within a specified period, typically 1 to 3 years, or forfeit their membership. This created a cruel dilemma for women who had successfully managed their late husband's business, but faced losing everything if they chose to remain unmarried. The quality control standards imposed by guilds created additional challenges for merchant women. Guild inspectors regularly examined goods sold by members, checking for proper materials, construction techniques, and adherence to established patterns or recipes. Women who had learned their trades informally, without the benefit of formal apprenticeships, often struggled to meet these exacting standards. Pricing regulations further complicated women's commercial activities. Guilds established fixed prices for most goods and services, eliminating the flexibility that many women relied upon to compete with their male counterparts. Unable to undercut established prices, women had to find other ways to attract customers, often through superior service or specialized products that fell outside guild jurisdiction. The guild court system provided another arena where women faced systematic disadvantages. When disputes arose between guild members, they were resolved through internal tribunals composed entirely of male guild masters. These courts handled everything from contract disputes to accusations of poor workmanship, and their decisions could make or break a merchant's reputation. Women appearing before guild courts often found themselves at a severe disadvantage. They typically lacked the personal relationships and political connections that male members used to influence proceedings. Moreover, the legal procedures followed by these courts assumed male participation, with little accommodation for the different social and legal status of women. The apprenticeship bottleneck created long-term problems for women seeking to establish their own businesses. Without formal training credentials, they struggled to gain credibility with suppliers, customers, and other merchants. This lack of recognized expertise made it difficult to secure credit, negotiate favorable terms with wholesalers, or establish the professional networks essential for commercial success. Some enterprising women attempted to circumvent guild restrictions by operating in trades that fell outside guild jurisdiction. These marginal activities often involved newer types of commerce or services that had not yet been formally organized into guild structures. However, this strategy carried significant risks, as successful businesses in unregulated trades often attracted guild attention and subsequent attempts at incorporation or suppression. The geographic limitations imposed by guild territories created additional complications for merchant women. Most guilds held exclusive rights to practice their trades within specific urban areas, and these territorial boundaries were fiercely defended. Women who moved from one city to another often found that their previous experience or even formal guild membership carried no weight in their new location. Cross-border trade presented particular challenges for women merchants. The complex web of agreements between different guild systems made it extremely difficult for women to establish trading relationships across regional boundaries. Male merchants could rely on established networks of guild brothers to facilitate long-distance commerce, but women lacked access to these crucial connections. The seasonal nature of many medieval trades created timing pressures that particularly affected women with family responsibilities. Guild activities often intensified during specific periods of the year, requiring members to dedicate long hours to their businesses precisely when domestic duties might be most demanding. Women struggled to balance these competing obligations without the household support systems available to their male counterparts. Religious restrictions added another layer of complexity to guild membership for women. Many guilds incorporated religious observances into their activities, holding feast days, processions, and other ceremonies that reinforced their social bonds. Women's participation in these events was often limited or prohibited entirely, reducing their opportunities to build the personal relationships essential for business success. The financial barriers to guild membership proved particularly onerous for women. Entry fees, annual dues, and various ceremonial expenses could consume a significant portion of a small merchant's income. Women, who typically operated with smaller capital reserves than their male counterparts, often found these costs prohibitive, forcing them to remain outside the guild system despite their desire to join. Master's examinations represented the final hurdle for those seeking full guild membership. These tests typically combined practical demonstrations of technical skill with oral examinations covering trade knowledge, guild regulations, and sometimes basic literacy or numeracy. Women who had learned their trades through informal channels often lacked the comprehensive knowledge expected by examining masters, making it difficult to pass these rigorous assessments. The social aspects of guild membership proved as important as the economic benefits, yet these two remained largely closed to women. Guild halls served as centers of male sociability, where business deals were negotiated over meals and drinks, political alliances were formed, and commercial intelligence was shared. Women's exclusion from these informal networks severely limited their access to the information and relationships that drove medieval commerce.
For medieval merchant women, marriage represented far more than romantic union. It was a calculated business decision that could determine the trajectory of their entire commercial enterprise. The choice of spouse could mean the difference between expanding their trade networks or losing everything they had worked to build.
Consider the story of Margaret de Clare, a wool merchant in 14th century England. When her first husband died, leaving her with a thriving textile business, she faced immediate pressure to remarry. The guild masters whispered that a woman alone could not maintain such extensive trade relationships. Suitors appeared at her door within weeks, each presenting their credentials not as lovers, but as potential business partners. Margaret's decision process reveals the complex calculations these women faced. She needed someone with complementary trade connections, preferably in regions where her current network was weak. Her late husband had established strong ties with Flemish weavers, but their Italian connections were limited. When Giovanni Mercante, a Venetian silk trader, proposed marriage, Margaret saw an opportunity to expand into Mediterranean markets. The negotiations preceding their marriage resembled a corporate merger more than a romantic courtship. Margaret's legal advisors insisted on maintaining separate business accounts. Giovanni demanded access to her Flemish contacts in exchange for introducing her to his Italian suppliers. They spent months drafting agreements that would protect both parties' commercial interests while creating new opportunities for joint ventures. This pattern repeated across medieval Europe. In the German states, merchant women often married within their guild networks, creating powerful commercial dynasties. The Fugger family's rise to prominence began when Barbara Fugger married strategically to expand their textile operations. Each marriage brought new trade routes, banking connections, and political alliances that strengthened their commercial empire. However, these business marriages came with unique challenges that male merchants rarely faced. Medieval law typically granted husbands control over their wives' property, a principle known as coverture. Savvy merchant women developed elaborate legal strategies to maintain control over their businesses while satisfying social expectations of wifely submission. The practice of establishing separate trading partnerships became increasingly common. A merchant woman might officially operate under her husband's name while maintaining independent control through carefully worded contracts. These agreements specified that certain trade relationships, inventory, or even entire business segments remained under the wife's direct management. Some couples created what modern observers might recognize as limited liability partnerships. The husband would handle public-facing negotiations and guild politics, while the wife managed operations, inventory, and financial planning. This division of labor allowed both parties to leverage their strengths while navigating social constraints. The textile trade offers numerous examples of successful merchant marriages that functioned as business partnerships. In Florence, silk merchants often married daughters of dye manufacturers, creating vertically integrated operations. The wife's family provided raw materials and technical expertise, while the husband's connections facilitated distribution and sales. These arrangements required constant negotiation and compromise. Merchant wives had to balance their business ambitions with social expectations of domestic responsibility. They were expected to manage households, raise children, and support their husbands' public roles while simultaneously running complex commercial operations. The challenge intensified when children entered the picture. Medieval merchant families faced difficult decisions about inheritance and succession. Sons typically inherited their father's businesses, but what happened to enterprises that wives had built independently? Some women established separate inheritance provisions, ensuring their daughters could inherit their commercial knowledge and connections. Cross-border marriages created additional complications. When English merchant women married Italian traders, they had to navigate different legal systems, currency fluctuations, and cultural expectations. Language barriers could complicate business communications, while different accounting practices required careful coordination. Religious differences sometimes influenced these business partnerships. Jewish merchant families in medieval Europe often faced restrictions on intermarriage, leading to complex arrangements with Christian business partners. Some couples converted to facilitate trade relationships, while others maintained separate religious practices while sharing commercial interests. The success of these partnerships often depended on mutual respect for each party's expertise. Merchant women who had established successful businesses before marriage brought valuable skills and connections. Husbands who recognized and leveraged these assets typically saw their joint enterprises flourish. Documentation from medieval guild records reveals the sophisticated nature of these business marriages. Contracts specified profit-sharing arrangements, decision-making authority, and procedures for resolving disputes. Some agreements included provisions for dissolving the business partnership while maintaining the marriage, or vice versa. The most successful merchant couples developed complementary specializations. One might focus on procurement and supplier relationships, while the other handled customer relations and market expansion. This division of expertise allowed them to compete effectively against larger trading houses while maintaining the flexibility of a family business. Widowhood presented both opportunities and challenges for merchant women. Those who had maintained active roles in their marriages often found themselves well-positioned to continue operations independently. However, social pressure to remarry remained intense, particularly for younger widows with valuable businesses. Some merchant women chose to remain unmarried after their husbands' deaths, using their commercial success to maintain independence. Others entered into business partnerships with other widows, creating all-female trading enterprises that challenged traditional gender roles while achieving remarkable commercial success. The legacy of these medieval business marriages extends far beyond their immediate commercial impact. They established precedents for women's participation in international trade and demonstrated that successful businesses could emerge from partnerships that balanced personal relationships with professional ambition. These merchant women navigated a complex web of legal, social, and economic constraints while building commercial enterprises that spanned continents. Their marriages were strategic alliances that required constant negotiation, compromise, and innovation to succeed in an environment that offered few protections for women's business interests.
The death of a husband in medieval times often marked a dramatic turning point in a merchant woman's life. While devastating personally, widowhood paradoxically offered many women their first taste of true economic independence. The legal doctrine of coverture, which had previously subsumed a wife's identity under her husband's authority, was lifted upon his death, leaving the widow to navigate the complex world of medieval commerce entirely on her own.
Medieval law generally recognized the widow's right to inherit a portion of her husband's estate, typically one-third, known as her dower right. However, the reality of claiming and maintaining these rights was far more complicated than legal texts suggested. Widows often faced immediate challenges from their late husband's business partners, creditors, and even family members who questioned their ability to manage commercial enterprises effectively. Consider the case of Agnes de Clerkenwell, a London merchant's widow in the early 14th century. When her husband Thomas died suddenly, leaving behind a thriving wool trading business, Agnes found herself thrust into negotiations with Flemish cloth merchants who had never dealt with a woman in positions of authority. These foreign traders initially refused to honor existing contracts, assuming that a woman could not possibly understand the intricacies of international wool pricing or quality standards. Agnes's response was both strategic and determined. She spent weeks studying her late husband's ledgers, memorizing trade routes, seasonal price fluctuations, and the specific preferences of various European buyers. When she finally met with the Flemish merchants, she demonstrated such detailed knowledge of their previous transactions that they were forced to acknowledge her competence. Within 6 months, Agnes had not only maintained her husband's existing trade relationships, but had also secured 2 new contracts that increased the business's profitability by nearly 20%. The legal complexities facing merchant widows extended far beyond simple inheritance rights. Many medieval cities had specific regulations governing how widows could operate businesses. In some German trading towns, widows were required to remarry within a year or sell their commercial interests to male relatives. This pressure to remarry was not merely social convention, but often legal necessity, as unmarried women faced restrictions on their ability to enter into binding contracts or represent themselves in commercial disputes. Yet many widows found creative ways to circumvent these limitations. Some formed partnerships with other women in similar situations, pooling their resources and expertise to create formidable commercial enterprises. Others maintained the appearance of male oversight by appointing male relatives or trusted employees as nominal business heads while retaining actual control over daily operations and strategic decisions. The widow Marguerite de Rouen exemplified this strategic approach to independence. After her husband's death left her with substantial debts and a failing grain trading operation, Marguerite officially appointed her teenage son as the business head while secretly rebuilding the enterprise from the ground up. She renegotiated supplier contracts, established new storage facilities, and developed innovative preservation techniques that allowed her to store grain longer and sell during periods of scarcity when prices peaked. Within 3 years, Marguerite had transformed the struggling business into one of Normandy's most profitable grain trading operations. Her success was so remarkable that other merchants began seeking her advice, leading to a secondary consulting business that provided additional income streams. However, Marguerite maintained the fiction of her son's leadership until he reached legal majority. understanding that her success depended partly on working within societal expectations while quietly subverting them. The emotional toll of widowhood combined with business pressures created unique challenges that male merchants rarely faced. Widows had to grieve their personal losses while simultaneously fighting to preserve their economic survival. Many medieval documents record the exhaustion and stress experienced by women trying to maintain commercial enterprises while managing households and raising children as single parents. Sleep deprivation was a constant companion for merchant widows. The responsibilities of overseeing international trade correspondence, managing local staff, negotiating with suppliers, and handling financial records often extended well into the night hours. Unlike their married counterparts who could delegate some responsibilities to husbands, widows bore the full weight of business operations alongside domestic duties that society still expected them to fulfill. The widow Isabella de Montpellier's personal diary, preserved in the archives of a French monastery, provides intimate insight into these daily struggles. Her entries describe rising before dawn to review shipping manifests, spending mornings in heated negotiations with silk merchants, dedicating afternoons to household management and children's education, and returning to business correspondence by candlelight after her family had retired for the evening. Isabella's diary reveals that she often survived on just 4 hours of sleep per night during busy trading seasons. Her health suffered considerably, and she frequently wrote about headaches, digestive problems, and what she described as a constant feeling of overwhelming fatigue. Yet she persisted because the alternative, losing the business and facing potential destitution, was far worse than the physical and emotional demands of independent commerce. Some widows found unexpected advantages in their new circumstances. Without husbands to consult or defer to, they could make business decisions more quickly and take calculated risks that might have been vetoed in a traditional partnership. The widow Elena de Pisa became renowned throughout the Mediterranean trading network for her ability to rapidly assess market opportunities and commit resources before competitors could react. Lena's most famous success came during a temporary disruption in eastern spice routes. While other merchants hesitated and debated responses, Elena immediately redirected her ships to alternative suppliers in North Africa, securing exclusive contracts for cinnamon and pepper that allowed her to dominate the Italian spice market for nearly 2 years. Her decisive action would have been impossible under the slower consensus-building approach that characterized many husband-wife business partnerships. The social isolation experienced by merchant widows was another significant challenge rarely discussed in historical accounts. Medieval society was structured around family units and married couples, leaving widows occupying an ambiguous social position. They were no longer under male protection, but were not quite independent agents in the eyes of their communities. Many widows found themselves excluded from social gatherings and business meetings that had been routine during their marriages. Former friends and business associates often viewed them with suspicion or pity, unsure how to interact with women who defied conventional expectations by continuing to operate in commercial spheres. This isolation could be professionally damaging, as medieval commerce relied heavily on personal relationships and informal networks of trust and information sharing. To combat this isolation, some merchant widows created their own networks and support systems. In several major trading cities, informal associations of businesswomen emerged, providing both practical assistance and emotional support. These groups shared information about market conditions, recommended reliable suppliers, and offered advice on navigating legal and social challenges specific to women in commerce. The Guild of Merchant Widows in Bruges, though never officially recognized by city authorities, operated as an effective support network for over a century. Members met monthly to discuss business challenges, share resources, and provide mutual assistance during difficult periods. The Guild maintained detailed records of successful negotiation strategies, reliable business partners, and potential threats to women-owned enterprises. As we drift deeper into the complexities of medieval widowhood and independent business, the remarkable resilience and ingenuity of these women becomes increasingly apparent. Their stories of survival and success against overwhelming odds provide a different perspective on medieval commerce, one that reveals the hidden strength and determination that shaped economic life in ways that traditional histories have often overlooked.
The pre-dawn darkness of medieval towns held a particular energy as merchant women prepared for another day of commerce. Long before the first church bells announced morning prayers, these industrious figures were already moving through their routines with practiced efficiency. depended entirely on their ability to maximize every precious hour of daylight trading.
Margaret the cloth merchant would rise at what we might consider 3 in the morning, her internal clock perfectly attuned to the rhythms of medieval commerce. Her first task involved checking the weather through the single window of her modest dwelling above her shop. Rain meant fewer customers, but also meant her woolen goods would be more appealing to those who did venture out. Clear skies promised crowds, but also increased competition from traveling merchants who preferred fair weather for their journeys. The ritual of preparing goods for display required both physical strength and artistic sensibility. Heavy bolts of cloth needed to be carried from storage areas and arranged in ways that would catch the eye of potential buyers. Medieval women understood the psychology of display long before modern marketing principles were established. Bright colors were positioned to catch morning light, while practical items like sturdy wool were placed within easy reach of customers' examining hands. Food merchants faced even more complex morning preparations. Agnes the baker had been working since midnight, her hands deep in dough while the rest of the town slept. The timing of bread production was absolutely critical. Too early, and the loaves would be stale by midday. Too late, and she would miss the morning rush of customers seeking fresh provisions. Her ovens, shared with neighboring bakers, operated on a carefully negotiated schedule that had been refined over years of cooperation and occasional conflict. The sounds of the medieval marketplace awakening created a symphony of commerce that modern ears would find both familiar and foreign. Wooden cart wheels rumbled across cobblestones as merchants transported their wares from storage to stalls. Metal tools clinked against each other as craftswomen arranged their displays. Voices called out early greetings and negotiations, creating a low murmur that would gradually build to the full roar of midday trading. Establishing a market stall required significant physical labor that fell entirely on the merchant woman's shoulders. Heavy wooden boards needed to be lifted and arranged to create display surfaces. Canvas or leather coverings had to be stretched and secured to protect goods from weather and theft. The medieval marketplace offered no modern conveniences, no electricity for lighting, no refrigeration for perishables, no security systems beyond what each merchant could provide for herself. The strategic positioning of goods within a stall reflected years of hard-won experience. Expensive items were kept close to the merchant's position where she could monitor them constantly. Fragile goods were placed away from the edges where passing crowds might accidentally damage them. Items that required customer handling, like fabric or tools, were arranged for easy access while maintaining clear sight lines that prevented theft. Customer interactions in medieval markets operated according to complex social protocols that merchant women had to master completely. The art of pricing required constant adjustment based on the customer's apparent wealth, the time of day, the availability of goods, and countless other factors. A noble's servant might pay premium prices without question, while a local craftsman would expect to negotiate every transaction down to the last penny. The language of medieval commerce involved far more than simple price negotiation. Merchant women needed to assess the creditworthiness of customers, understand the complex web of local debts and obligations, and navigate the delicate social hierarchies that determined who could be trusted with goods before payment. A single mistake in judgment could result in significant financial losses that a small business could not absorb. Weather presented constant challenges that required immediate adaptation. A sudden rainstorm could destroy textile goods in minutes if they weren't properly protected. Strong winds could scatter lightweight items across the marketplace, leading to losses and disputes over ownership. Extreme cold made handling money difficult and reduced customer traffic significantly. Merchant women developed elaborate systems of covers, weights, and protective barriers to guard against these natural threats. The midday rush represented the peak of market activity and the greatest test of a merchant woman's skills. Customers pressed around stalls in dense crowds, creating opportunities for both sales and theft. Multiple conversations had to be conducted simultaneously while maintaining awareness of inventory levels and watching for suspicious behavior. The ability to remember complex orders, calculate prices quickly, and provide correct change while managing crowd dynamics separated successful merchants from those who struggled. Inventory management required mental calculations of extraordinary complexity. Medieval merchants had no written accounting systems in the modern sense. Everything depended on memory and simple tally marks. The cloth merchant needed to track not only how many yards of each fabric remained, but also remember which customers had expressed interest in specific items, what prices had been quoted, and when promised goods needed to be delivered. The afternoon hours brought different challenges as the initial rush subsided and merchants faced the pressure of moving remaining inventory. Perishable goods needed to be sold at reduced prices rather than risk total loss. Non-perishable items could be held for better market conditions, but this tied up capital that might be needed for other opportunities. These decisions required sophisticated understanding of local economic patterns and seasonal demand cycles. Closing the market stall at day's end involved as much work as opening it had required. Unsold goods needed to be carefully packed and transported back to storage areas. Display materials had to be dismantled and secured against theft or weather damage. The day's earnings required counting and safekeeping in an era when banking services were extremely limited and personal security was entirely self-provided. The physical toll of market operations accumulated relentlessly over years of daily repetition. Lifting heavy goods, standing for 12 or more hours, and working in all weather conditions aged merchant women prematurely. Their hands became permanently stained by dyes and rough from handling coarse materials. Their backs ached from bending over low stalls and carrying heavy loads. Yet this physical sacrifice was the foundation upon which their economic independence was built. Evening brought the crucial task of planning for the following day's operations. Successful merchant women spent considerable time analyzing the day's sales patterns, identifying which items moved quickly and which remained unsold. This information guided decisions about what goods to acquire, how to price them, and where to position them for maximum impact. The medieval marketplace was intensely competitive, and survival depended on constant adaptation and improvement. The cycle would begin again before dawn, as merchant women across medieval Europe prepared to face another day of challenges, opportunities, and the endless demands of commercial survival in an unforgiving economic landscape.
The medieval world was connected by an intricate web of trade routes that stretched across continents, through treacherous mountain passes, across stormy seas, and along dusty roads that seemed to disappear into endless horizons. For merchant women, these routes represented both opportunity and peril, pathways to prosperity that demanded courage, cunning, and an acceptance of risks that would make modern travelers shudder.
The great trade routes of medieval Europe formed the arteries of commerce, carrying goods, ideas, and ambitious merchants across vast distances. The Silk Road, though primarily associated with Asian trade, had European connections that drew merchants from Italian city-states and northern European trading centers. The Hanseatic League created a network of maritime and overland routes connecting the Baltic and North Seas with inland markets. The Via Francigena carried pilgrims and merchants from Canterbury to Rome, while countless smaller routes crisscrossed the continent like capillaries feeding the larger commercial bloodstream. Women merchants navigating these routes faced dangers that began the moment they left the relative safety of their home cities. Bandits and highway robbers were perhaps the most immediate and persistent threat. These criminals understood the rhythms of trade, positioning themselves at strategic points where merchants were most vulnerable. River crossings, mountain passes, dense forests, and the approaches to major cities all became hunting grounds for those who preferred theft to honest labor. The methods employed by medieval bandits were varied and often brutally effective. Some operated in small groups, using stealth and surprise to overwhelm merchant caravans. Others formed larger bands that could challenge even well-protected trading expeditions. They knew which goods were most valuable and portable, targeting spices, silk, precious metals, and finished textiles while often ignoring bulkier, less valuable commodities. For women merchants, the threat was compounded by the additional risks of assault and kidnapping, crimes that could destroy not only their business ventures but their entire lives. Weather presented another formidable adversary that showed no mercy to merchants regardless of their gender. Medieval travelers had no reliable weather forecasting, no emergency services to rescue them from sudden storms, and limited shelter options along many routes. Spring floods could make rivers impassable for weeks, stranding merchants with perishable goods that rotted while they waited. Summer droughts could dry up water sources, forcing travelers to carry heavy supplies or risk dehydration in regions where the next reliable water source might be days away. Winter travel was particularly treacherous, with snow and ice making roads nearly impassable and temperatures that could kill the unprepared. Merchant women traveling in winter faced the additional challenge of maintaining their health and safety while managing their business interests. The heavy clothing required for warmth made movement difficult, while the shortened daylight hours compressed the time available for safe travel. Many routes became completely unusable during winter months, forcing merchants to either risk dangerous conditions or accept months of lost trading opportunities. The condition of medieval roads themselves presented constant challenges that modern travelers can barely imagine. Most roads were little more than dirt tracks that became muddy quagmires in wet weather and dusty, rutted obstacles in dry conditions. Stone-paved Roman roads still existed in some areas, but many had fallen into disrepair, with broken stones and missing sections creating hazards for travelers and their pack animals. Bridge construction was limited and expensive, meaning that river crossings often required fords that could become impassable or dangerous with changing water levels. Navigation presented its own set of difficulties for merchant women traveling unfamiliar routes. Maps were rare, expensive, and often inaccurate, leaving travelers dependent on local guides whose reliability varied greatly. Some guides were honest professionals who knew their territories intimately, but others were opportunists who might lead merchants astray for personal gain or in collaboration with bandits. The ability to read natural signs, understand local dialects, and judge the character of potential guides became essential skills for successful merchant women. Political instability added another layer of complexity to medieval travel. Wars between kingdoms, disputes between nobles, and local conflicts could suddenly make previously safe routes extremely dangerous. A merchant woman might set out on a familiar path only to discover that political circumstances had changed, turning allies into enemies and safe havens into potential traps. Border crossings became particularly problematic during times of conflict, with merchants facing interrogation, confiscation of goods, or imprisonment based on their origins or perceived loyalties. The challenge of finding secure accommodation along trade routes was particularly acute for women merchants. Medieval inns and hostels varied enormously in quality and safety, from reputable establishments that catered to wealthy merchants to dangerous hovels where travelers risked theft, assault, or worse. Women traveling alone or in small groups were especially vulnerable, as they lacked the physical protection that larger merchant companies could provide. Many learned to seek accommodation in religious houses, which generally offered greater safety, but might not always be available or willing to house commercial travelers. Disease presented an invisible but deadly threat along medieval trade routes. Crowded inns, contaminated water sources, and poor sanitation created perfect conditions for the spread of illness. Merchant women had to maintain their health while traveling through regions where plague, dysentery, and other diseases could strike without warning. The Black Death of the 14th century demonstrated how quickly disease could spread along trade routes, turning commercial pathways into corridors of death that claimed the lives of countless merchants and their families. The logistics of medieval travel required careful planning and substantial resources. Merchant women needed to arrange for pack animals, hire guards or travel companions, purchase supplies for extended journeys, and coordinate their movements with seasonal trading patterns. The cost of travel could easily consume a significant portion of potential profits, making successful trip planning essential for business survival. A miscalculation in timing, route selection, or resource allocation could turn a profitable venture into a financial disaster. Communication challenges compounded all other difficulties faced by traveling merchant women. With no postal systems or rapid communication methods, merchants often traveled for weeks or months without news from home or their business partners. This isolation meant that they had to make important decisions without current information about market conditions, political developments, or family circumstances. The ability to adapt quickly to changing situations and make sound judgments with limited information became crucial skills for success. Despite these formidable challenges, many merchant women not only survived but thrived on medieval trade routes. They developed networks of contacts and allies, learned to read the subtle signs that indicated danger or opportunity, and built reputations for reliability and fair dealing that opened doors throughout their trading territories. Their success required not just business acumen, but also physical courage, psychological resilience, and an understanding of human nature that allowed them to navigate the complex social and political landscapes they encountered on their journeys.
The weight of medieval taxation fell particularly heavily upon merchant women, creating layers of financial obligation that could crush even the most successful enterprises. Unlike modern tax systems, with their standardized rates and clear regulations, Medieval taxation was a complex web of overlapping authorities, each demanding their share of a merchant woman's hard-earned profits.
At the foundation of this system lay the royal taxes, imposed by the crown to fund wars, maintain the court, and support the kingdom's infrastructure. These taxes came in various forms, from the traditional scutage that replaced military service with monetary payment, to the more direct levies on trade goods. Merchant women found themselves caught between their obligations as subjects of the realm and their need to maintain profitable businesses. The Danegeld, originally collected to pay off Viking raiders, had evolved into a regular royal revenue stream by the high medieval period. This tax was assessed on land and property, meaning that successful merchant women who had invested their profits in real estate faced substantial annual obligations. A wool merchant in York might find herself paying not only on her shop and warehouse, but also on any residential properties she owned or rented to others. Royal purveyance presented another significant burden, requiring merchants to supply goods to the royal household at below market prices, or sometimes with payment delayed indefinitely. When the king's court traveled through a region, local merchants were obligated to provide food, lodging, and supplies. For a female innkeeper or food merchant, this could mean weeks of serving the royal entourage while receiving only promises of future payment that might never materialize. Beyond royal taxation, merchant women faced the complex web of feudal obligations. If they held land directly from a lord, they owed various services and payments. Relief payments were required when inheriting property, often amounting to a full year's income from the inherited lands. Harriet, the death duty paid to the lord, typically required surrendering the deceased's best animal and most valuable possession. For a merchant woman who had built her wealth through trade, this could mean losing essential business assets upon her husband's death. The feudal system also imposed aids, special taxes collected for specific purposes such as ransoming the lord, funding his eldest son's knighthood, or providing a dowry for his eldest daughter. These irregular but substantial levies could arrive at the worst possible times, forcing merchant women to liquidate inventory or borrow money at high interest rates to meet their obligations. Marriage taxes created additional complications for merchant women. The merchant paid for permission to marry was followed by childwipe for bearing children outside marriage and lairwipe for adultery. Even legitimate business relationships could be misconstrued, leading to accusations and fines that had little to do with actual wrongdoing, but everything to do with generating revenue for local authorities. Urban taxation added yet another layer of complexity. Towns and cities imposed their own taxes to fund walls, bridges, markets, and civic buildings. Demurrage tax for wall construction, pauntage for bridge maintenance, and pavage for road repair all fell upon urban merchants. Female traders found themselves paying not only for the infrastructure they used, but also for defensive works that protected their communities from raiders and rival towns. Market taxes were perhaps the most directly burdensome for merchant women engaged in regular trade. Stallage fees for market stalls, passage tolls for bringing goods to market, and weighing fees for using official scales all ate into profit margins. A cloth merchant traveling between towns might pay dozens of small fees and taxes along her route, each reducing the profitability of her venture. The guild system, while providing some protection and standardization, also imposed its own financial burden. Guild membership fees, annual dues, and special assessments for guild activities all required payment. Female guild members often paid the same rates as their male counterparts while having less voice in how the money was spent. Guilds also imposed fines for various infractions, from selling substandard goods to violating price agreements, creating an additional source of financial uncertainty. Church taxation represented another significant drain on merchant resources. The tithe, theoretically a tenth of all income, was supplemented by various ecclesiastical fees and special collections. Merchant women were expected to contribute to church construction projects, support religious festivals, and pay for prayers for deceased family members. The mortuary fee, paid upon death, often claimed valuable business assets just when a widow needed them most to continue her trade. Ecclesiastical courts also imposed fines for moral infractions, real or imagined. A merchant woman accused of charging usurious interest rates, trading on holy days, or engaging in any behavior deemed inappropriate for her station could face substantial financial penalties. These moral taxes served both to regulate behavior and generate revenue for the church hierarchy. The complexity of medieval taxation created opportunities for corruption and abuse. Tax collectors, whether royal officials, feudal bailiffs, or urban authorities, often demanded bribes or inflated assessments. Merchant women lacking the political connections of their male counterparts were particularly vulnerable to such exploitation. The tax collector might claim that goods were undervalued, that proper documentation was missing, or that additional fees were required for processing payments. Record keeping for tax purposes presented its own challenges in an era of limited literacy. Merchant women needed to maintain detailed accounts of their transactions, property holdings, and tax payments to avoid double taxation or disputes with authorities. Those who could not read or write had to rely on clerks or scribes, adding another expense to their tax burden and creating opportunities for fraud or error. The timing of tax collection often conflicted with the seasonal nature of medieval trade. Harvest taxes came due when agricultural products were most abundant, but before they could be processed and sold at higher prices. Royal levies might be demanded during winter months when trade was slowest and cash reserves were lowest. This mismatch between tax obligations and business cycles forced many merchant women into debt or required them to sell goods at unfavorable prices. Currency fluctuations and debasement added another layer of complexity to tax obligations. When taxes were assessed in one currency but payment was required in another, merchant women faced exchange rate risks. Royal debasement of coinage meant that taxes paid in older, purer coins represented a higher real cost than originally calculated. Some authorities demanded payment in specific types of currency, forcing merchants to exchange their holdings at unfavorable rates. The cumulative effect of these various taxes and fees could consume a substantial portion of a merchant woman's income. Successful traders might find themselves paying 30 to 40% of their profits in various forms of taxation, not including the informal bribes and gifts necessary to maintain good relationships with officials. This heavy tax burden limited capital accumulation and made it difficult for merchant women to expand their businesses or weather economic downturns. Tax evasion, while risky, was sometimes the only way to maintain profitability. Merchant women developed various strategies to minimize their tax burden, from underreporting income to timing transactions to avoid peak assessment periods. However, the penalties for tax evasion were severe, often including confiscation of property and goods, making this a dangerous gamble for those with limited resources to absorb losses.
The medieval church wielded tremendous influence over commercial activities, and merchant women found themselves navigating a complex web of religious restrictions that could make or break their livelihoods. These weren't merely suggestions or moral guidelines, but enforceable laws that carried serious consequences for those who dared to transgress.
The concept of usury dominated medieval commerce, defining any lending of money at interest as a mortal sin. This presented immediate challenges for merchant women who needed to extend credit to customers or secure loans for their own ventures. The church's interpretation of biblical passages, particularly from Deuteronomy and Luke, created a rigid framework that condemned profit from money lending as exploitation of the poor and needy. Women merchants developed creative workarounds to navigate these restrictions. Rather than charging explicit interest, they would inflate the prices of goods sold on credit, disguising the interest as part of the commodity cost. A bolt of silk that cost 10 shillings in cash might be sold for 12 shillings on credit, with the extra 2 shillings representing hidden interest charges that couldn't be prosecuted as usury. The church also regulated market activities through the concept of just price, derived from Thomas Aquinas' teachings on fair exchange. This doctrine held that goods should be sold at their true value, without excessive profit that would constitute theft from buyers. Merchant women had to carefully balance their need for profit with religious expectations of fairness, often finding themselves caught between economic necessity and spiritual obligation. Sunday trading restrictions created another layer of complexity for women merchants. The church mandated that markets and shops remain closed on Sundays and holy days, which could number over 100 days per year, depending on the local religious calendar. For women operating small businesses with limited capital, losing these trading days meant significant financial hardship, especially during peak seasons when demand was highest. Religious authorities often viewed women's participation in commerce with particular suspicion, drawing on biblical passages that emphasized women's domestic roles. The church taught that women should be keepers of the home, and their involvement in public commerce was seen as potentially corrupting to both their own souls and the moral fabric of society. This created additional scrutiny for merchant women, who might find their business practices questioned more rigorously than their male counterparts. The sacrament of confession became a regular ordeal for merchant women, who were expected to confess any potential sins related to their commercial activities. Parish priests, often lacking sophisticated understanding of complex business transactions, might declare legitimate practices sinful, forcing women to choose between their livelihoods and their spiritual standing in the community. Charitable obligations imposed by the church added another financial burden to merchant women's operations. The doctrine of almsgiving required Christians to donate a portion of their wealth to the poor, and merchant women were expected to demonstrate their piety through generous contributions to local parishes, monasteries, and charitable institutions. Failure to contribute adequately could result in social ostracism and loss of business relationships. The church's prohibition on certain types of merchandise created additional complications for women traders. Items deemed morally questionable, such as dice, playing cards, or overly luxurious clothing, could not be sold by devout Christians without risking excommunication. Women merchants had to carefully curate their inventories to avoid accusations of promoting vice or vanity among their customers. Religious feast days and fasting periods significantly impacted the types of goods that could be sold during different times of the year. During Lent, for example, the sale of meat, dairy products, and other forbidden foods was restricted, forcing merchant women to adjust their inventories and find alternative sources of income during these extended periods of reduced demand. The concept of simony, the buying and selling of church offices or sacred objects, created particular dangers for women who might unknowingly purchase or sell items with religious significance. Even trading in second-hand goods could become problematic if those items had been blessed or consecrated, as their commercial sale might be interpreted as trafficking in sacred objects. Marriage laws imposed by the church created additional complications for merchant women. Canon law required wives to obtain their husband's permission for significant business transactions, and widows faced restrictions on remarriage that could affect their ability to maintain business partnerships or access credit. The church's emphasis on female chastity and modesty also limited women's ability to travel for trade or engage in the kind of networking that was essential for commercial success. Religious guilds, which combined commercial and spiritual functions, often excluded women from full membership despite their significant contributions to various trades. These organizations controlled access to markets, set quality standards, and provided mutual support for members, but women were typically relegated to auxiliary roles that limited their ability to influence decisions affecting their livelihoods. The church's teachings on poverty and wealth created a complex moral landscape for merchant women. While commercial success was not inherently sinful, the accumulation of excessive wealth was viewed with suspicion, and women who became too prosperous might face accusations of greed or exploitation. This created pressure to maintain a careful balance between financial success and spiritual acceptability. Pilgrimage obligations imposed by the church could disrupt business operations for extended periods. Merchant women might be required to undertake religious journeys to distant shrines, leaving their businesses in the hands of others or facing complete closure during their absence. These journeys, while spiritually meaningful, represented significant financial sacrifices that male merchants could more easily delegate to family members. The church's influence extended to the regulation of weights and measures, with religious authorities often overseeing market standards to ensure fair dealing. Merchant women had to navigate not only secular regulations, but also religious oversight of their business practices, with church officials empowered to investigate and punish commercial fraud or deception. Excommunication represented the ultimate religious sanction against merchant women who violated church teachings on commerce. This spiritual punishment carried devastating social and economic consequences, as excommunicated individuals were shunned by the community and forbidden from participating in religious ceremonies, effectively ending their ability to conduct business in medieval society. Despite these numerous restrictions and challenges, many merchant women found ways to maintain their faith while pursuing commercial success. They developed sophisticated strategies for compliance with religious law, built relationships with sympathetic clergy, and contributed generously to church causes to maintain their standing in the community. Their perseverance in the face of religious obstacles demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability in an era when spiritual and commercial concerns were inextricably intertwined.
The textile industry represented perhaps the most significant avenue for women's economic participation in medieval commerce. Yet, it remained a realm fraught with gender-based restrictions and economic vulnerabilities. Women's involvement in textile production spanned the entire spectrum of the industry, from the humble spinner working in her cottage to the wealthy silk merchant trading across international borders. However, their experiences varied dramatically based on social class, geographic location, and the specific branch of textile work they pursued.
In the wool trade, which dominated much of medieval Europe's economy, women found themselves essential yet marginalized participants. The process of wool production required numerous specialized skills, many of which became associated with female labor through centuries of tradition and economic necessity. Women typically handled the initial stages of wool preparation, including sorting, cleaning, and carding the raw fleece. This work, while crucial to the entire industry, was often undervalued and poorly compensated compared to the later stages of production controlled by male artisans. The spinning of wool into thread represented one of the most widespread forms of women's work in medieval society. Nearly every household contained a spinning wheel or distaff, and women of all social classes engaged in this activity. For merchant families, spinning served multiple purposes beyond mere household necessity. Wealthy merchant wives often supervised large spinning operations, employing dozens of women to produce thread for commercial sale. These arrangements created complex hierarchies within female labor, with merchant women acting as intermediaries between the male-dominated guild system and the female workforce. The organization of spinning work revealed the intricate ways gender shaped medieval commerce. Merchant women who organized spinning operations faced unique challenges in managing their workforce while navigating the legal and social restrictions placed upon their gender. They could not directly join the relevant guilds, yet they needed to maintain relationships with guild members to access markets for their products. This created a shadow economy where women's commercial activities operated parallel to, but separate from, the official channels of trade. Weaving presented another avenue for women's participation in the textile industry, though one that varied significantly across different regions and time periods. In some areas, women dominated certain types of weaving, particularly the production of linen and simple woolen fabrics. However, as weaving technology advanced and the industry became more profitable, male weavers increasingly sought to exclude women from the most lucrative aspects of the trade. This pattern repeated across many textile specialties, with women finding their traditional roles diminished as economic opportunities expanded. The silk industry offered unique opportunities for women merchants, particularly in regions with established silk production. Unlike wool, which required significant physical strength for some processes, silk work relied more heavily on fine motor skills and attention to detail, qualities that medieval society associated with feminine capabilities. Women merchants in silk-producing regions like Italy and parts of France could build substantial businesses around silk trading, though they still faced the fundamental legal limitations that affected all women in commerce. Italian silk merchants provide some of the most documented examples of successful women in the medieval textile trade. These women often inherited their businesses from deceased husbands or fathers, then expanded operations through careful management and strategic partnerships. However, their success remained precarious, dependent on maintaining good relationships with male business partners and navigating the complex web of guild regulations and municipal laws that governed their activities. The dyeing and finishing of textiles represented another specialized area where women merchants could establish profitable enterprises. The knowledge of dye preparation and application often passed through female family lines, creating dynasties of women skilled in these arts. However, the most valuable dyes, particularly those imported from distant lands, remained largely controlled by male merchants who dominated long-distance trade networks. Women dyers typically worked with locally available materials or purchased expensive imported dyes through male intermediaries. The seasonal nature of much textile work created additional challenges for women merchants in this industry. Sheep shearing occurred only once or twice per year, creating periods of intense activity followed by months of reduced demand for processing services. Women who organized spinning or weaving operations needed to maintain their workforce through these fluctuations while managing the financial pressures of irregular income. Many developed strategies for diversifying their activities, combining textile work with other forms of commerce or household production. Regional variations in textile production created different opportunities and challenges for women merchants across medieval Europe. In Flanders, where the wool trade reached extraordinary levels of sophistication, women found numerous niches within the industry's complex supply chain. However, the intense competition and political instability that characterized Flemish textile centers also created significant risks for women merchants who lacked the political connections and legal protections available to their male counterparts. The rise of urban textile centers fundamentally altered the landscape for women's participation in the industry. Cities like Florence, Bruges, and London developed highly organized textile industries with complex guild structures and sophisticated commercial practices. While these developments created new opportunities for some women, they also led to increased formalization of trade practices that often excluded women from the most profitable activities. Women's roles in textile commerce often extended beyond direct production to encompass various support services essential to the industry's functioning. They operated boarding houses for traveling merchants, provided storage facilities for textile goods, and offered specialized services like cloth inspection and quality assessment. These activities, while not directly productive, required significant business acumen and provided important sources of income for women merchants. The international nature of the textile trade created particular challenges for women merchants seeking to expand their operations beyond local markets. Long-distance travel remained dangerous and socially unacceptable for most women, forcing them to rely on male agents or partners for accessing distant markets. This dependence limited their ability to develop the personal relationships that were crucial for success in medieval commerce, placing them at a significant disadvantage compared to male merchants who could travel freely. The technological innovations that transformed textile production during the later medieval period had complex effects on women's participation in the industry. New spinning wheels and improved looms increased productivity, but also required greater capital investment, potentially excluding women who lacked access to significant financial resources. However, these same innovations also created new opportunities for women who could adapt to changing production methods and market demands. The relationship between women textile merchants and the guild system remained one of the most significant factors shaping their commercial experiences. While formal guild membership was typically restricted to men, women often participated in guild activities through their relationships with male family members. Some guilds developed associate memberships or special categories for widows, recognizing the practical necessity of allowing women to continue operating established businesses while maintaining the fiction of male dominance in commercial affairs. The scent of fresh bread wafting through narrow medieval streets often led back to women's hands. Food production and sale represented one of the most accessible yet demanding paths for merchant women, requiring skills passed down through generations and an intimate knowledge of community tastes and seasonal rhythms. Bread baking formed the cornerstone of many women's commercial enterprises. The process began before dawn, when bakers would kindle their ovens and begin the laborious task of mixing, kneading, and shaping loaves. Guild regulations strictly controlled bread production, specifying everything from grain quality to loaf weight. Women bakers faced constant scrutiny from guild inspectors who would arrive unannounced to test their products. The assize of bread, a medieval law governing bread production, created a complex system of price controls tied to grain costs. When wheat prices fluctuated, bakers had to adjust their loaf sizes accordingly, maintaining fixed prices while varying portions. This system placed enormous pressure on women bakers, who needed to calculate precise measurements daily while managing their household economies. Agnes the baker, working in 14th century London, exemplified the challenges faced by women in bread production. Her day began at 3 a.m, lighting the great oven that dominated her shop's ground floor. She would mix the dough by hand, her arms aching from the repetitive kneading motion required to develop proper gluten structure. The physical demands were immense, requiring strength to lift heavy sacks of grain and endurance to work through long hours. Quality control presented constant challenges. Medieval flour varied dramatically in quality, containing everything from wheat and barley to occasional adulterants like ground beans or peas during times of scarcity. Women bakers developed sophisticated techniques for assessing grain quality, testing moisture content by feel and examining color and texture. A single batch of poor-quality bread could destroy a reputation built over years. The brewing industry offered another avenue for women's food production enterprises. Ale brewing required specialized knowledge of fermentation processes, grain malting, and flavor development. Women brewers, known as brewsters, dominated this trade in many regions, operating from their homes or small commercial premises. The process demanded careful attention to temperature, timing, and ingredient quality. Brewing began with malting, where barley grains were soaked, allowed to germinate, then dried to develop the enzymes necessary for fermentation. Women brewsters would spread the grain on malting floors, turning it regularly to ensure even sprouting. The malted grain was then ground and mixed with hot water to create wort, a sweet liquid that would ferment into ale. Temperature control proved crucial during fermentation. Medieval brewsters developed intuitive understanding of seasonal variations, adjusting their processes for summer heat and winter cold. They would test fermentation progress by taste and smell, determining when the ale reached proper strength and flavor. The entire process, from malting to finished product, could take several weeks. Market regulations governing ale sales created additional challenges. Ale tasters, appointed by local authorities, would visit breweries to test product quality and ensure fair pricing. Women brewsters faced fines for producing weak ale, overcharging customers, or selling contaminated products. These regulations, while protecting consumers, created financial risks for small-scale producers. Marjorie the Brewster, operating in medieval Norwich, managed a typical small brewing operation. She would produce several barrels of ale weekly, selling directly to neighbors and local taverns. Her reputation depended on consistency, requiring her to maintain detailed mental records of successful recipes and techniques. A single batch of sour ale could cost her regular customers and damage her standing in the community. Dairy production offered opportunities for women with access to livestock. Cheese making required specialized knowledge of milk handling, curd formation, and aging processes. Women cheesemakers would begin with fresh milk, carefully monitoring temperature as they added rennet to form curds. The curds were then pressed, salted, and aged in cool storage areas. Different cheese varieties required distinct techniques and aging periods. Soft cheeses could be sold within days, providing quick income, while hard cheeses needed months of careful aging. Women producers had to balance immediate cash needs against the higher profits available from aged products. Storage space and capital requirements made cheese production challenging for women with limited resources. Seasonal variations affected all aspects of food production. Spring brought fresh milk and early vegetables, while autumn harvest provided grains and fruits for preservation. Women food producers needed to plan their operations around these natural cycles, preserving surplus products during abundant seasons to sustain sales through leaner periods. Preservation techniques formed essential skills for food merchants. Women would salt meat, dry fruits, pickle vegetables, and smoke fish to extend shelf life. These processes required precise knowledge of salt ratios, drying conditions, and storage methods. Improperly preserved foods could spoil quickly, creating financial losses and potential health hazards for customers. The spice trade offered lucrative opportunities for women with sufficient capital. Imported spices commanded high prices, but required substantial initial investment and knowledge of quality assessment. Women spice merchants would purchase goods from wholesale importers, then retail them to local customers. Success required understanding of different spice varieties, their culinary applications, and proper storage methods. Competition in food markets could be intense. Women producers competed not only with each other, but also with male merchants and established guilds. Success required building loyal customer relationships through consistent quality and fair pricing. Many women developed specialties, becoming known for particular products like exceptional bread, flavorful ale, or perfectly aged cheese. Customer relationships formed the foundation of successful food enterprises. Women merchants would extend credit to regular customers, particularly during difficult economic periods. These informal credit arrangements created networks of mutual obligation, with customers returning loyalty for flexibility in payment terms. However, unpaid debts could threaten business survival. The physical demands of food production took their toll on women's health. Constant exposure to heat from ovens and cooking fires, repetitive motions from kneading and stirring, and long hours of standing created chronic health problems. Many women developed respiratory issues from flour dust and smoke, joint problems from repetitive work, and burns from handling hot equipment. Despite these challenges, food production offered women relatively stable income opportunities. Everyone needed food, creating consistent demand for quality products. Successful women food merchants could build thriving businesses, supporting their families and gaining respect within their communities. The essential nature of food production provided a measure of economic security unavailable in many other trades. Food production and sale represented both opportunity and challenge for medieval merchant women. While offering accessible entry into commercial life, it demanded extensive knowledge, physical endurance, and careful business management. Success required balancing quality production with cost control, building customer relationships while managing competition, and maintaining health while meeting demanding work schedules.
In the shadowy corners of medieval commerce, where the scent of fermenting grain mingled with wood smoke and human sweat, women carved out one of their most enduring economic niches. The brewing of ale and the management of taverns represented perhaps the most widespread female-dominated trade of the medieval period. Yet, it came with its own unique constellation of challenges, dangers, and social complications that would test even the most determined merchant woman.
The art of brewing had been women's work since time immemorial. In households across medieval Europe, from the humblest peasant cottage to the grandest manor house, women tended the brewing vats with the same careful attention they gave to their cooking fires and herb gardens. This domestic skill naturally evolved into commercial opportunity as towns grew, and the demand for ale increased among urban populations who lacked the space or resources to brew their own. Dame Margaret of Southwark discovered this transition from household brewing to commercial enterprise in the most practical way possible. When her husband's carpentry business struggled during a particularly harsh winter in 1342, she began selling her surplus ale to neighbors. What started as a few extra pennies quickly became a steady income stream that soon surpassed her husband's earnings. Within 2 years, she had transformed the ground floor of their home into a proper tavern, complete with wooden benches, clay cups, and a reputation for the finest ale south of the Thames. But Margaret's success came at a considerable cost. The brewing process itself was physically demanding work that required strength, endurance, and precise timing. She would rise before dawn to tend her fires, spending hours stirring massive cauldrons of boiling wort, her arms aching from the constant motion, her face flushed from the heat. The malting process required her to spread barley across her floors, turning it regularly by hand until it reached the perfect stage of germination, then carefully drying it over controlled fires that she had to monitor day and night. The financial investment required to establish a proper brewing operation was substantial. Quality brewing vessels made of copper or iron could cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in several months. Margaret had to purchase these gradually, starting with smaller vessels and reinvesting her profits into larger equipment. She needed steady supplies of barley, hops, and fuel for her fires, requiring her to establish relationships with farmers and suppliers who often demanded payment in advance or charged higher prices to women they viewed as less reliable business partners. The regulatory environment surrounding brewing created another layer of complexity. Most towns had established ale tasters, official inspectors who would arrive unannounced to test the quality and pricing of her product. These men held considerable power over her livelihood, able to impose fines, confiscate stock, or even ban her from brewing if they found her ale substandard or overpriced. Margaret learned to maintain careful relationships with these officials, sometimes providing them with free drinks or small gifts to ensure favorable treatment, expenses that cut into her already thin profit margins. The social dynamics of tavern management presented unique challenges for women. Margaret's establishment became a gathering place for laborers, merchants, and travelers, predominantly male customers who often viewed her simultaneously as a service provider and potential romantic target. She had to maintain a delicate balance, being friendly enough to encourage repeat business, while remaining distant enough to avoid unwanted advances or damage to her reputation. Late evening hours, when ale had loosened tongues and inhibitions, required particular vigilance and often the presence of male relatives or hired help to maintain order. Competition among brewers was fierce and often personal. In Margaret's neighborhood alone, 5 other women operated brewing businesses, each fighting for the same customer base. Price wars were common, with brewers undercutting each other until profit margins disappeared entirely. Quality competitions could turn vicious, with rivals spreading rumors about contaminated ingredients or unsanitary brewing conditions. Margaret once discovered that a competitor had been telling customers that her ale was watered down, an accusation that took months of careful relationship building to overcome. The seasonal nature of brewing created additional financial pressures. Summer heat made fermentation unpredictable and storage difficult, while winter cold could freeze brewing vessels and make fuel prohibitively expensive. Margaret had to carefully manage her cash flow throughout the year, saving profits from good months to survive the lean periods. She also had to maintain relationships with ice merchants in summer and fuel suppliers in winter, additional business relationships that required time, energy, and often unfavorable credit arrangements. Legal troubles were a constant concern for women in the brewing trade. Accusations of selling adulterated ale, overcharging customers, or operating without proper licenses could result in hefty fines or imprisonment. Margaret faced 3 separate legal challenges during her first 5 years of operation, including one case where a customer claimed her ale had made him ill. The legal proceedings consumed weeks of her time and required her to hire advocates, expenses that nearly bankrupted her business before the charges were eventually dismissed. The physical toll of brewing work was cumulative and often devastating. The constant exposure to heat and steam left many brewers with respiratory problems, while the heavy lifting required to move grain sacks and water barrels caused chronic back and joint pain. Margaret's hands were permanently stained from handling hops and scarred from burns suffered while tending her fires. By her 40th year, she walked with a noticeable limp from a fall while carrying a heavy brewing vessel, an injury that never properly healed due to her inability to rest sufficiently during the recovery period. Family obligations complicated every aspect of tavern management. Margaret had to coordinate her brewing schedule around her children's needs, often working through the night when they were small to avoid interrupting their sleep with the noise and activity of her trade. As they grew older, she faced the difficult decision of whether to involve them in the business, knowing that association with tavern keeping could damage their future marriage prospects or career opportunities. The reputation management required for successful tavern operation was perhaps the most exhausting aspect of the business. Margaret had to maintain relationships not only with her customers, but with suppliers, competitors, local officials, church leaders, and neighborhood families. A single incident, a drunken brawl in her establishment, or rumors of improper behavior could destroy years of careful reputation building. She spent considerable time and energy attending community events, making charitable donations, and cultivating relationships with influential townspeople who could defend her character if needed. Despite these overwhelming challenges, women like Margaret persisted in the brewing trade because it offered something rare in medieval commerce: genuine economic independence. A successful brewer could earn enough to support her family, accumulate savings, and even pass a thriving business to her daughters. The skills were transferable, allowing women to relocate and reestablish their trade in new communities. Most importantly, brewing provided women with a socially acceptable way to operate in the commercial sphere, while still maintaining their domestic roles and community standing. As we settle deeper into our exploration of medieval merchant women's lives, let the rhythmic bubbling of fermenting ale and the soft murmur of tavern conversations carry you toward peaceful rest, knowing that these determined women found ways to thrive even in the most challenging circumstances. The medieval marketplace was a battlefield of commerce, where merchant women faced fierce competition from multiple fronts. Unlike their male counterparts who often enjoyed guild protections and established networks, women merchants navigated a complex web of rivalries that could make or break their businesses overnight. In the bustling market squares of 13th century London, competition came from every direction. Local merchants jealously guarded their territories, viewing any newcomer as a threat to their established customer base. For women entering these markets, the challenge was doubled. They not only had to prove their goods were superior, but also demonstrate their right to trade in spaces traditionally dominated by men. The guild system created artificial barriers that intensified competition for women merchants. While male merchants could rely on guild membership for protection, standardized pricing, and market access, women often found themselves operating outside these protective structures. This meant they had to compete not just on quality and price, but also on their ability to secure basic trading rights that men took for granted. Consider the textile markets of medieval Florence, where women weavers and cloth merchants faced constant pressure from guild-protected male competitors. These women had to offer their goods at lower prices to attract customers, cutting into their already thin profit margins. The guild merchants could afford to maintain higher prices because their association guaranteed them certain market privileges and customer loyalty. Seasonal competition added another layer of complexity to women's trading experiences. During harvest festivals and religious celebrations, temporary merchants flooded the markets, offering goods at rock-bottom prices. These seasonal traders, often men with other primary occupations, could afford to sell at a loss because trading wasn't their main source of income. Women merchants, who depended entirely on their trading profits, couldn't compete with such pricing strategies. The rise of foreign merchants in major trading cities created unprecedented competitive pressure. Italian merchants in northern European cities, Flemish traders in English ports, and German merchants in French markets brought exotic goods and established trading relationships that local women merchants struggled to match. These foreign traders often had access to better credit arrangements and could offer goods at prices that undercut local competition. Geographic competition proved particularly challenging for women merchants who lacked the resources for long-distance travel. While male merchants could establish trading relationships across multiple cities and regions, women were often confined to local markets. This limitation meant they faced intense competition within their immediate area while being unable to access potentially more profitable distant markets. The emergence of specialized merchant families created dynasties that dominated certain trade sectors. These established merchant houses, typically male-dominated, had generations of trading relationships, accumulated wealth, and political connections that new entrants couldn't match. Women trying to break into these established markets found themselves competing against businesses with decades or centuries of accumulated advantages. Price wars were common in medieval markets, and women merchants often found themselves caught in destructive cycles of undercutting. Without the financial reserves that many male merchants possessed, women couldn't sustain prolonged price competition. A week of selling goods below cost could devastate a woman's business, while larger male-operated enterprises could weather such storms more easily. Innovation became a survival strategy for many women merchants facing intense competition. Unable to compete on established terms, they developed new products, services, or trading methods. Women in the food trade, for example, began offering prepared meals and specialty items that required skills traditionally associated with domestic work. This innovation often put them ahead of male competitors who were slower to adapt to changing market demands. The credit system created competitive advantages that favored established male merchants. Banks and money lenders were more willing to extend credit to men, allowing them to purchase larger quantities of goods and offer better prices to customers. Women merchants with limited access to credit had to operate with smaller inventories and higher per-unit costs, making it difficult to compete on price. Reputation management became crucial in competitive medieval markets. A single negative incident could destroy a woman merchant's business, while male merchants often had more resilience against reputation damage. Women had to maintain higher standards of conduct and product quality because they couldn't afford the luxury of recovering from mistakes that might be forgiven in male competitors. The timing of market entry significantly affected competitive dynamics. Women who entered established markets faced the challenge of displacing existing relationships between customers and established merchants. Those who identified emerging market opportunities had better chances of success, but this required market knowledge and timing that was difficult to acquire without established trading networks. Collaborative competition sometimes emerged among women merchants who recognized their shared challenges. In some markets, women formed informal alliances, sharing information about suppliers, customers, and market conditions. These collaborations helped level the playing field against better established male competitors, though such arrangements required careful balance between cooperation and competition. The legal framework surrounding competition often disadvantaged women merchants. Laws governing trade disputes, contract enforcement, and market access were typically written and enforced by men, creating a system where competitive conflicts were resolved in ways that favored male merchants. Women had to navigate not just market competition, but also legal systems that didn't necessarily protect their interests equally. Technological changes in production and transportation created new competitive pressures throughout the medieval period. The introduction of improved looms, better preservation techniques, or more efficient transportation methods could suddenly make established businesses obsolete. Women merchants with limited capital for reinvestment often struggled to keep pace with technological advances that their better-funded male competitors could more easily adopt. Customer loyalty patterns reflected the broader social attitudes toward women in business. Some customers preferred dealing with male merchants, viewing them as more reliable or authoritative. Women merchants had to work harder to build customer relationships and often had to prove their competence repeatedly, even with long-term customers who might still harbor doubts about women's business capabilities. The competitive landscape varied significantly by trade sector. In markets dealing with goods traditionally associated with women's work, such as textiles, food preparation, or household items, women merchants faced different competitive pressures than those entering male-dominated trades like metalwork or long-distance commerce. Understanding these sector-specific dynamics was crucial for women choosing their areas of specialization. As we drift deeper into understanding these competitive pressures, we begin to see how market dynamics shaped not just individual businesses, but entire communities of merchant women who learned to adapt, innovate, and survive in an economic environment that rarely offered them equal footing with their male counterparts. The path to becoming a successful merchant woman began long before any actual trading took place. Education and business training formed the foundation of commercial success, though the methods and availability of such education varied dramatically across different regions and social classes. Unlike their male counterparts who might attend formal schools or universities, merchant women typically learned their trade through more informal but equally rigorous channels. Most merchant daughters received their initial business education within the family structure. From as early as age 7 or 8, girls would observe their mothers conducting household accounts, negotiating with suppliers, and managing domestic commerce. This wasn't merely watching from the sidelines. Young girls were expected to participate actively in these daily commercial activities, gradually taking on more responsibility as they demonstrated competence and understanding. The merchant household served as a comprehensive business school. Girls learned to calculate profits and losses using Roman numerals and later Arabic numerals as they became more widely adopted. They practiced writing business correspondence, initially copying their mother's letters word for word, then gradually composing their own under careful supervision. These early lessons in literacy were precious, as many women outside merchant families never learned to read or write at all. Mathematical skills were particularly crucial for merchant women. They needed to master various currency systems, as medieval Europe used dozens of different coins and monetary standards. A merchant woman might need to convert between Florentine florins, Venetian ducats, English pounds, and local currencies, all within a single transaction. They learned to calculate exchange rates, interest on loans, and the complex mathematics of profit margins across multiple currencies and markets. Record keeping formed another essential component of merchant education. Women learned to maintain detailed account books, tracking inventory, debts, credits, and expenses with meticulous precision. These weren't simple lists, but sophisticated accounting systems that could withstand scrutiny from tax collectors, business partners, and legal authorities. The ability to produce accurate, detailed records often meant the difference between business success and financial ruin. Language skills were equally important for merchant women, particularly those involved in international trade. Many learned to speak and read multiple languages fluently. A merchant woman in Bruges might need to communicate in Flemish, French, Italian, and German, all within the same market day. They learned not just conversational skills, but specialized commercial vocabulary, understanding the precise meanings of trade terms in different languages to avoid costly misunderstandings. The guild system provided another avenue for business education, though access varied significantly by location and trade. In some cities, merchant guilds allowed women